Panjshir Valley, Afghanistan. September 1986. The morning chill still clung to the rocks. At a Soviet motorized rifle regiment's forward headquarters, the routine was numbingly familiar. Sentries smoked. Field kitchen stoves hissed. Officers in their greatcoats studied maps in tents, the fabric glowing from within like paper lanterns. Then a sound cut the quiet. Not the shriek of incoming D-30 howitzer shells, a sound known and measured. This was different. A series of hard, dry thumps from a distant ridge, like a giant slamming a heavy door shut, 6 times in rapid succession. Heads turned, squinting. Calculations began instinctively. Mortars? Recoilless rifles? There was no time for more. The sky above the base tore open. 6 supersonic arrivals, not arcs but near vertical plunges of pure kinetic fury. The impacts were not sequential. They were simultaneous, a single, catastrophic detonation that rolled across the valley in one wave of pressure and flame. Barracks buildings dissolved into splinters. Parked BTR armored personnel carriers were lifted off their wheels, thrown onto their sides like toys. The earth itself seemed to boil. When the smoke cleared, a crater field of perfect geometric horror scarred the ground. Not random shell holes. A precise, calculated rectangle of utter destruction. Silence returned, deeper now, broken only by crackling fire and distant alarms. Soviet soldiers stumbled from cover, ears ringing, faces smeared with dust and disbelief. An artillery officer stood frozen, surveying the devastation. His training, his manuals, his entire understanding of firepower offered no explanation. This was not the war he knew. This was a message written in high explosives and delivered from over 20 kilometers away. A message that the rules of engagement had just been rewritten. The question hung in the acrid air. What weapon system on Earth could do this? To understand the shock of that morning in the Panjshir, one must first understand the Soviet Army's theological faith in artillery. Since the cataclysm of the Great Patriotic War, the Red Army, and its successor, the Soviet Armed Forces, had codified a brutal, simple doctrine. Artillery was the god of war. Victory was not won by the clever maneuver of infantry or the daring of tank crews alone. It was forged in a preliminary fire smayat, a crushing avalanche of steel and high explosives that would physically and morally annihilate everything in a designated sector before the first soldier advanced. This doctrine was a product of geography, history, and industrial scale. The vast European plain, the expected theater of World War III, was seen as a perfect canvas for massed firepower. Soviet artillery parks were built around this principle. Towed howitzers like the 122mm D-30 and the colossal 152mm 2A-65, self-propelled giants like the 2S-3 Akatsia and 2S-5 Jayatsynt, and the iconic truck-mounted Katyusha and its successors, the Grad, Urigan, and Smerch rocket launchers. Volume was virtue. A Soviet division could deliver more shells in a 30-minute preparation than many NATO corps. The system was centralized, hierarchical, and devastatingly effective against defined front lines and fixed positions. When the Politburo made the fateful decision to intervene in Afghanistan in December 1979, this doctrine marched in with the 40th Army. The initial invasions were, in Soviet terms, surgical. Airborne units seized key infrastructure in Kabul, while motorized rifle divisions crossed the Amu Darya. The enemy was defined as a limited number of counter-revolutionary Dushmen, bandits, and the unreliable Afghan Communist Forces, the DRA. Artillery would play its classic role, supporting advancing columns, reducing fortified villages, and providing a secure fire base. But Afghanistan refused to conform to the map. This was not the Fulda Gap. This was a country of vertical geography, of labyrinthine valleys, of towering mountain passes that nullified line of sight and limited ranges. The enemy had no front line, no headquarters complex to target, no massed formations to obliterate. The god of war found himself in a realm of ghosts. Soviet artillery units, trained for set-piece bombardments, were now tasked with firing in support of small, isolated outposts under siege. They shelled mountain trails in vain hopes of hitting caravan routes. They expended thousands of shells on abandoned village strongpoints, only for the mujahideen to melt back into the crags. The sheer weight of fire was immense. At the peak of the war, Soviet forces were firing over 2 million shells and rockets per year, but its effectiveness was questionable. It was like using a sledgehammer to swat flies. The psychological impact on the population was profound, creating fresh recruits for the resistance. The logistical toll on the Soviet Union was staggering, as a constant train of shells had to be hauled from the USSR across the Salong Pass. Yet, within this frustration, A certain grim equilibrium had been established by the mid-1980s. The Soviets adapted. They learned to use helicopters as spotters. They established formidable Zastava outposts with pre-registered defensive fires. Their counter-battery radars like the 1B-13 ZU and 1B-14 RIS became feared tools for detecting the flash and trajectory of Mujahideen mortar and recoilless rifle teams, allowing for devastatingly quick return fire. Soviet gunners, though weary, still held a profound technological and organizational advantage. They controlled the skies and the heavy guns. The war was a bloody stalemate, but the Soviet military believed it understood the parameters of the conflict. The Mujahideen, for their part, fought with courage and increasing tactical skill, but their arsenal was a chaotic mosaic. It ranged from ancient Lee Enfield rifles to Chinese Type 56 AKs, from British-era 3-inch mortars to Egyptian-made RPG-7s. Their most potent artillery pieces were often Soviet D-30 howitzers captured in daring raids or towed over the border from Pakistan. These were prized weapons, but their use was fraught with danger. Firing a D-30 required a prepared position, a crew of trained men and time. The Soviet ZU radar could locate them within minutes, often calling down a hail of Grad rockets in retaliation. The Mujahideen needed a weapon that could strike deep, strike hard, and vanish before the inevitable counterstrike. They needed to break the artillery equilibrium. And halfway across the world, in the factories and planning rooms of the United States, a system was being built that would do exactly that, a system designed not for the mountains of Afghanistan, but to shatter Warsaw Pact armored divisions on the German plain. Its journey to the Hindu Kush would become one of the most consequential technological transfers of the Cold War. The American response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was immediate and multifaceted. President Jimmy Carter, in what he would later call the most difficult decision of his life, initiated a covert program to arm and fund the Afghan resistance. This mission, codenamed Operation Cyclone, would grow exponentially under the Reagan administration into the largest CIA covert action in history. But arming a pre-industrial guerrilla force to fight a modern superpower required more than just rifles. It required a strategy of asymmetric escalation, finding tools that could inflict disproportionate pain on the Soviet military machine. Initially, the weaponry flowed from existing, deniable stocks: Egyptian and Chinese AK-47s, British blowpipe missiles, older mortars. The turning point came with the arrival of the FIM-92 Stinger man-portable air defense system in 1986. The decision to send the Stinger was fiercely debated, as it represented a leap in technology that could not be disguised as obsolete surplus. Its impact was seismic, fundamentally challenging Soviet air superiority. But the Stinger addressed only one pillar of Soviet power, the helicopter. The other pillar, artillery, remained dominant. The solution emerged from a parallel overt revolution in US Army doctrine. Since the 1970s, NATO planners had been fixated on the Soviet armored threat, the prospect of thousands of T-72 and T-80 tanks rolling across the inner German border. To stop them, the US developed the airland battle concept, which emphasized deep strikes against second-echelon forces before they could engage. This required a new kind of artillery, not just more accurate but exponentially faster and more lethal over great distances. The answer was the M270 Multiple Launch Rocket System, MLRS. Entering service in 1983, it was a masterpiece of automated firepower. Mounted on a tracked M993 chassis, its key component was a self-contained, disposable launch pod containing 12 M26 227mm rockets. A single crew of 3 could operate the system. Its revolutionary fire control computer allowed it to lay itself automatically, fire a full salvo in under 60 seconds, and then move before the first rocket even hit its target, a tactic known as shoot and scoot. Each M26 rocket carried 644 M77 dual-purpose improved conventional munition, PICM, submunitions, effectively 7,728 grenade-sized bomblets raining down over an area the size of 6 football fields. A battery of 3 MLRS launchers could blanket a kilometer-square grid with 23,184 submunitions in 1 minute, a level of saturation that promised to exterminate any armored formation caught in the open. But the system's crown jewel, still in advanced development as the war in Afghanistan raged, was its potential for precision. The MLRS launcher was designed not just for area saturation, but as a modular universal field artillery pod system. It could fire the Army Tactical Missile System, MGM-140 ATACMS, a short-range ballistic missile with a range of over 100 miles and a unitary warhead for pinpoint strikes on command posts, airfields and logistics nodes. This was a system designed to decapitate and disrupt a modern army at the operational level. The conduit for this technology to the Mujahideen was Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, ISI. The ISI, under the fierce leadership of General Akhtar Abdur Rahman, was not merely a passive pipeline. It was an active manager of the war, determining which factions received aid, coordinating operations, and pushing relentlessly for more advanced weaponry. The ISI saw the Mujahideen not just as freedom fighters, but as a proxy force to bleed the Soviet Union and secure strategic depth for Pakistan. They understood that to break the stalemate, the resistance needed to shift from harassing tactics to delivering decisive, conventional-style blows against Soviet bases and garrisons. By 1984–85, the pressure from the ISI and within the U.S. national security apparatus was mounting. The Stinger had proven that high-tech transfers could be a game-changer. The question became, what next? The Soviet artillery menace was the single greatest killer of Mujahideen and the enabler of their hold on key valleys. The answer, though audacious, was logical. The full M270 launcher was too large, too complex, and too politically sensitive to send. But its munitions could be adapted. Reports and proposals began circulating in Washington. Could the rockets of the MLRS be fired from a simpler, mobile platform? Could the United States give the Mujahideen the ability to outrange and outgun the Soviet artillery god of war, on his own terms? In the workshops of Pakistan's Ordnance Corps and in the minds of CIA technicians, a plan took shape. They would create a guerrilla version of the world's most advanced artillery system. The goal was not to win a battle of attrition, but to deliver a systemic shock, to stun the Soviet commanders with a demonstration of technological and tactical inferiority in their own core competency. The weapon that was built to fight World War III was about to be unleashed in a remote, mountain war, with consequences no one could fully predict. The stage was now set. In the corridors of the Kremlin and the headquarters of the 40th Army in Kabul, confidence in their firepower doctrine, though strained, remained intact. They did not know that a storm of steel, conceived in American laboratories and assembled in Pakistani workshops, was already being manhandled onto the backs of Mujahideen trucks, destined for the high passes overlooking their bases. The equilibrium of firepower was a fragile illusion, and it was about to be shattered. For Sergeant Viktor G. Chernov, a 25-year-old senior gunner with a Soviet 2S-3 Akatsia self-propelled howitzer battery, the war was a grind of noise, dust, and relentless mathematics. His world was the steel coffin of the 152mm howitzer, the scent of cordite and sweat, the shouted coordinates over the radio. His expertise was measured in seconds, the time from receiving a fire mission to the first round leaving the barrel. His safety depended on the 1B-13 ZU counter-battery radar vehicle, nestled a kilometer behind his position, its radar dish spinning silently. It was an electronic guardian angel. When a Dushman mortar fired, the ZU would detect the shell in flight, compute its trajectory backward, and within 2 minutes Chernov's battery would be raining high-explosive shells on the launch point. It was a brutal, efficient equation that reinforced a sense of dominance. The enemy had to expose himself to fight. Chernov could fire from a prepared, camouflaged position. He was a technician in a vast, mechanical system. His opposite number was Muhammad Ismail, a 32-year-old former schoolteacher from Logar-turned-Mujahideen commander in the Hizb-i-Islami Khalis faction. Ismail's artillery was a single, prized 122mm D-30 howitzer, captured in a night raid on a DRA outpost in 1983. To fire it was an orchestrated crisis. The heavy 6-ton tube had to be towed by a battered truck to a pre-scouted valley floor under cover of darkness. The crew of 8 would manhandle it into position, digging the trail spade into the hard earth, calculating firing angles with a compass and map. The firing would be frantic, a dozen shells at most before the shouted order, "Tala! Tala! Go! Go!" The truck would be hitched and they would flee, hearts pounding, waiting for the inevitable retaliation. They lost 3 guns and 15 men to Soviet counter-battery fire in 2 years. The D-30 was a symbol of pride but also of vulnerability. It tied them to a piece of ground, and in the Soviet calculus, ground could always be targeted. The introduction of the MLRS rockets, specifically the M26 pods adapted for use from simple truck-mounted frames, changed Ismail's reality. CIA and ISI technicians, working with Pakistani ordnance officers, created a crude but effective launch system. A metal frame that could hold 1 or 2 MLRS rocket pods, mounted on the bed of a Toyota Hilux or a Soviet-made ZIL truck captured from the DRA. The system was called the General Purpose Lightweight Multiple Launch Rocket System by the Americans, The Mujahideen called it simply Shaitani Chark, the devil's wheel, or Satan's cart. For Ismail's crew, the drill transformed. No more digging. No more complex laying of a heavy gun. The launch frame was pre-angled. The firing sequence was reduced to connecting a simple electrical trigger from a car battery to the rocket pod's connector. A spotter with a radio on a distant ridge would send coordinates. Ismail would confirm the truck was aligned, often using just a compass bearing. The driver remained behind the wheel, engine running. On command, the technician would touch the wires. The result was not the deep thump of the D-30, but a deafening, continuous roar as up to 12 rockets tore from their tubes in a stuttering 4-second cataract of fire and smoke. The entire truck would shroud itself in a huge dust cloud from the backblast. Before the last rocket had even cleared the tube, the driver was in gear, lurching forward, careening down mountain tracks to a hideout miles away. For Sergeant Chernov, the first encounter with the Shaitani Chark was a discontinuity in his ordered world. The zoo radar operator watching his screen would see not the single clear parabola of a mortar or howitzer shell, but a clustered bloom of multiple, smaller, faster signatures appearing almost simultaneously from a single point, and then nothing. By the time the computer processed the data and a counterfire mission was relayed to Chernov's battery, the launch point was already empty, just tire tracks and scorched earth. The retaliation shells would land on barren ground. The psychological effect was profound. The equation had been inverted. Now, the Mujahideen could strike from over 20 kilometers away, far beyond the range of most Soviet divisional artillery except the heavy Smerch systems, which were rarely deployed forward, and they could vanish before the system could react. The god of war was suddenly blind, his thunder answered by a ghost. The shock experienced by Soviet artillerymen stemmed from confronting a system that was a generation ahead in its design philosophy. The Soviet BM-21 Grad and its larger siblings, the Urigan and Smerch, were magnificent, brutal instruments of area saturation. They were essentially linear descendants of the World War II Katyusha. Multiple launch tubes on a truck or chassis, fired electrically in a ripple or full salvo. Their strength was volume and simplicity. A Grad battery could fire 40 rockets in 20 seconds, turning a square kilometer into a hellscape of fragmentation and flame. But they were dumb systems. Firing was an art of manual calculation and estimation. Dispersion was wide. Reloading was a lengthy, labor-intensive process of manually hauling and inserting individual rockets into each tube, a vulnerability measured in minutes. The American M270 MLRS was a different beast entirely. It was a fully integrated weapons system, not just a launcher. Its core was the self-contained launch pod/container. This was a sealed aluminum module containing 2 6-rocket packs. Once the 12 rockets were fired, the crew did not reload tubes. They simply used the onboard crane to lift off the empty pod and lower a new, preloaded one onto the launch rack. A trained crew could perform this action in under 5 minutes, turning a key vulnerability into a brief operational pause. The true revolution was digital. The M270's cabin housed a fire control computer, FCC, linked to a position and azimuth determining system, PADS. Upon halting at a firing point, the system would use gyroscopes and sensors to determine its own exact location and orientation on the Earth. The crew would input target coordinates received via digital data link. The FCC would then automatically calculate the ballistic solution, elevate and traverse the launch pod to the precise angle, and even calculate the optimal firing interval between rockets to ensure the entire salvo landed simultaneously for maximum shock effect. This time-on-target capability meant the first and last rocket of a salvo, fired seconds apart, would impact within the same second, denying the enemy any warning between the first explosion and the last. This was the technical explanation for the near-simultaneous, rectangular destruction witnessed in the Panjshir. For the Mujahideen, the CIA and ISI provided a radically simplified, guerrillaized version of this technology. They did not receive the M270 vehicle. Instead, they received the M26 rocket pods themselves, often with simple, locally fabricated electrical firing mechanisms mounted on truck beds. The rockets, however, retained their advanced internal ballistics. Each M26 rocket was 13 feet long, weighed 675 pounds, and contained a warhead of 644 M77 BICM submunitions. These were not simple high-explosive charges. Each M77 bomblet was designed to penetrate over 100 millimeters of steel armor from above, making it lethal to tanks, while also producing a casing of 300 jagged steel fragments for anti-personnel effect. The fusing was sophisticated, allowing for airburst patterns. This meant that even without the M270's pinpoint accuracy, a salvo would distribute its submunitions over a vast, deadly footprint. The psychological effect of this steel rain was terror, compounded by the lingering threat of duds that turned the impact zone into a minefield. But the deeper, more ominous shadow for Soviet intelligence analysts was the system's potential. The MLRS was designed from the outset to fire the MGM-140 ATACMS, Army Tactical Missile System. While it is highly unlikely, and there is no verifiable evidence, that ATACMS missiles were transferred to Afghanistan during the Soviet War, the very knowledge of its existence poisoned Soviet planning. ATACMS was a short-range ballistic missile with a range of 100 to 150 kilometers, guided by an inertial navigation system, carrying a 1,000-pound class unitary warhead or submunitions. If the Dutchmen had systems that could fire M26 rockets, could they one day receive these? The implication was paralyzing. A Soviet airfield in Bagram, a headquarters complex in Kabul, the crucial Salong Tunnel, all could theoretically be struck with precision from sanctuaries in Pakistan without a single mujahideen needing to cross the border. This forced a fundamental reconsideration of operational security far behind the front lines. The technological specter of ATACMS, whether physically present or not, expanded the battlefield in the Soviet mind, creating strategic anxiety from a tactical weapon. The contrast was stark. Soviet artillery was about mass and forward deployment, pushing tubes as close as possible to support the infantry. The MLRS philosophy, even in its crude mujahideen form, was about deep strike and dispersion, hitting critical nodes from standoff ranges with overwhelming automated firepower before vanishing. It was a confrontation between the industrial age concept of artillery as a hammer and the emerging information age concept of artillery as a scalpel connected to a network. In the mountains of Afghanistan, the scalpel, wielded by a 19th-century-style guerrilla force, was proving it could cripple the hammer. The tactical battlefield in Afghanistan was a duel between sensor and shooter, between a high-tech system designed to impose order and a low-tech adaptation designed to exploit chaos. At the heart of the Soviet system was its counter-battery radar complex, a network of electronic eyes that had, until the mid-80s, given them a near-unchallengeable advantage in the artillery duel. The workhorse was the 1B-14 RIS Lynx, and its mobile variant, the 1B-13 ZU. These were Doppler radars mounted on armored vehicles. Their principle was straightforward but effective. When a mortar shell, artillery round, or rocket was fired, its supersonic flight created a distinct signature. The radar would detect the projectile in mid-flight, track its path for a short segment, and a connected computer would instantly calculate the ballistic arc backwards to its point of origin. The coordinates of the enemy launcher would be transmitted via secure link to a divisional artillery command post. Within 90 to 120 seconds, Soviet howitzers or Grad batteries, their firing data pre-calculated, would begin raining counter-battery fire on that location. For traditional mujahideen mortar and recoilless rifle teams, this was often a death sentence. It turned every firing position into a potential trap, compressing their engagement timeline to a desperate few minutes before they had to displace. The Mujahideen's use of the adapted MLRS rockets shattered this kill chain. The weakness of the Soviet system lay in its processing loop and its design parameters. The ZU radar was optimized to track single, relatively large projectiles like 120mm mortar shells or 122mm howitzer rounds. The M26 rocket from the MLRS pod presented a different profile. It was smaller, faster, and launched in a tight sequence. When a Shaitani Chark truck fired its salvo, the radar screen would light up not with one clear trace, but with a cluster of a dozen small, fast-moving signatures appearing in rapid succession from virtually the same point. This was an anomaly. The system's computer, programmed for clarity, could be overwhelmed or confused by the data spike. Even if it successfully computed a point of origin, the critical factor was time. The Soviet counter-battery loop, detect, compute, transmit, order, fire, took just over 2 minutes at its best. The Mujahideen engagement was complete in under 45 seconds. The sequence was brutally efficient. Stop truck. Connect wires. Fire 12 rockets in a 4-second rippling roar. Disconnect. Driver accelerates away. By the time the first Soviet radar operator had confirmed the anomalous contact, the launch truck was already a kilometer down a wadi, shrouded in its own dust cloud and the general terrain clutter. The counter-battery shells would land on an empty stretch of road, accomplishing nothing but the waste of precious ammunition. This forced a catastrophic shift in Soviet tactical posture. The reliability of their electronic guardian was broken. No garrison, no convoy rest stop, no headquarters could be considered outside of sudden, catastrophic strike range. The psychological impact was as damaging as the physical. The constant, low-grade anxiety of guerrilla war was now compounded by a new, existential fear for rear-echelon troops. They were no longer just hunting or being hunted by infantry, they were targets in a targeting solution. The Soviet response was tactically regressive and costly. They were forced to disperse their forces even more thinly, reducing the payoff of any single MLRS strike but also weakening their own cohesion and logistical efficiency. They increased patrolling and reconnaissance in the deep zones 20 to 30 kilometers from their bases, attempting to find and interdict the launch teams before they could set up, a task akin to finding a needle in a mountainous haystack, and one that exposed more troops to ambush. Most significantly, they attempted to create hardened shelters for aircraft, command vehicles and fuel depots. But Afghanistan was a theater of expeditionary warfare, not the fortified German plain. The resources and engineering effort required to build concrete revetments across dozens of forward operating areas were staggering and ultimately unsustainable. The MLRS, a system designed to shatter NATO air bases, was now forcing the Soviet 40th Army into a defensive fortress mentality, a posture antithetical to their doctrine of offensive action and deep battle. The hunter had been forced to dig a hole. The introduction of the MLRS rockets to Afghanistan was not a spontaneous act of charity. It was the calculated result of a sophisticated, multi-layered intelligence operation, a move on the grand chessboard of the Cold War informed by signals intercepts, satellite imagery, and the powerful precedent of a previous game-changing transfer. The decision-making loop in Langley and the Pentagon mirrored, in a darker reflection, the Soviet counter-battery loop. Detect a weakness, compute a solution, and deliver a precise strike against the enemy's center of gravity. The first and most critical intelligence tool was space-based reconnaissance. US Kh-9 Hexagon and Kh-11 Kennen spy satellites passed daily over Afghanistan. Their images provided a god's-eye view of the war's progression. Analysts at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, pored over these images, tracking patterns. They could see the Soviet adaptation to the Stinger threat, the construction of helicopter revetments at Bugram and Shindand, the altered flight patterns of Hind gunships, the increased use of fixed-wing Su-25s for close air support from higher altitudes. But they could also see the enduring strength of the Soviet artillery network, the well-established fire bases, the logistics trains supplying shell depots, the predictable positioning of counter-battery radars. The imagery revealed a system that was robust but rigid, a system optimized for a linear war with its critical nodes, ammunition dumps, radar vehicles, command posts, placed just behind the front lines which in Afghanistan's asymmetrical conflict, were everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. This imagery was fused with signals intelligence SIGINT, from listening posts in Pakistan and from orbiting aircraft like the RC-135 rivet joint. Soviet artillery units, confident in their superiority, were often lax with radio discipline. Intercepts could reveal the locations of battalion and regimental headquarters, the frequencies used by counter-battery networks, and even the morale-sapping chatter after a successful Mujahideen attack. The Americans were building an electronic order of battle, understanding not just where the Soviet artillery was, but how it communicated and reacted. The final, decisive piece of intelligence was human feedback from the theater. CIA case officers and ISI handlers debriefed Mujahideen commanders after every major engagement. These after-action reports were raw, tactical gold. They detailed the limitations of the D-30, the vulnerability to counterfire, the difficulty of movement, the sheer weight of ammunition required. The commanders articulated a clear, desperate need. A weapon that could outrange the Soviet guns, deliver a knockout blow, and allow them to survive the retaliation. This frontline demand converged perfectly with the satellite and signals imagery showing static, valuable Soviet targets. The precedent that made the MLRS transfer conceivable was the FIM-92 Stinger. The 1986 decision to supply the Stinger had been arguably more controversial. It involved transferring a current-generation, top-tier U.S. weapon system with sensitive seeker technology. The debate raged: would it be captured? Would it proliferate? Would it escalate the conflict uncontrollably? Yet its impact was immediate and spectacular. Soviet close air support was dramatically curtailed. Helicopter assault tactics were fundamentally altered. The Stinger proved that a single high-technology system could shift the tactical balance and impose disproportionate costs on the Soviet military. It also proved that the Mujahideen with ISI training could handle and effectively employ sophisticated Western technology. The success of the Stinger broke the psychological barrier in Washington. It created a template. Identify a pillar of Soviet tactical dominance, air power, then artillery, find a Western system that could undermine it, and transfer a version through the ISI pipeline. The MLRS rockets were the logical next step. The risk of the launcher technology falling into Soviet hands was mitigated by providing only the disposable rocket pods, fired from improvised platforms. The fear of escalation was balanced against the demonstrated Soviet inability to respond effectively to the Stinger. They could not escalate further without a massive and politically untenable expansion of the war. Thus, the intelligence cycle closed. Satellites and intercepts identified the target set and the enemy's procedural weakness. Human intelligence confirmed the tactical requirement. The precedent of the Stinger validated the high-stakes strategy. The result was a decision that appeared tactical but was deeply strategic. To arm a guerrilla force with a weapon designed to fight World War III, not to win a mountain skirmish, but to demonstrate to the Soviet General Staff that even their most sacrosanct military doctrines were vulnerable to the relentless, innovative pressure of a proxy war. The message was clear. In Afghanistan there was no sanctuary, and no aspect of your military power is beyond our reach. The initial strikes were isolated, puzzling, and devastating. They did not conform to any known pattern in the Soviet threat database. In the summer and autumn of 1986, sporadic reports filtered up from Division to 40th Army Headquarters in Kabul, and from there to the main intelligence directorate GRU, in Moscow. A motorized rifle company annihilated in its cantonment area in Paktia. A fuel depot at Jalalabad airfield obliterated in a fireball that lit up the night sky for an hour. A communications relay station on a mountain top in Logar reduced to tangled metal and splintered concrete. The local commander's initial reports often cited massed mortar fire, or lucky strike by a large-caliber rocket. But the scale and precision of the destruction betrayed those simple explanations. The first concrete evidence came from metallurgy and ordnance intelligence. After each attack, if the location could be safely reached, teams from the 40th Army's rocket and artillery service would scour the impact craters. They collected jagged fragments of rocket casings, the distinctive hexagonal scattering of submunition bomblets, many unexploded, and the peculiar lightweight fins of the projectiles. These fragments were not Soviet. They were not Chinese. They were not of Eastern Bloc manufacture. The aluminum alloys, the machining marks, the design of the fusing mechanisms, all pointed to a Western, likely American, origin. The most telling discovery was the M77 BICM submunition. This small, shape-charged grenade was unlike anything in the Soviet arsenal. Its design was purely for anti-armor and anti-personnel use from above, a hallmark of NATO's focus on defeating Soviet armored columns. Finding it in the mountains of Afghanistan was a profound anomaly. Simultaneously, signals intelligence, SIGINT, operators began piecing together a new pattern in Mujahideen communications. Intercepted radio traffic, often in clear language due to the Mujahideen's lack of sophisticated crypto, started to contain new code words. The terms Keres, a traditional underground irrigation channel, or Tash, stone, were sometimes used in conjunction with grid coordinates, followed by the phrase Dawa Saroya, medicine delivered. More chilling were the after-action intercepts where commanders reported not just damage, but a specific, boastful phrase, Zoo de Kana na she, the zoo cannot see it. Soviet listeners understood this immediately. The zoo was their 1B-13 counter-battery radar. The enemy was not just using a new weapon, they were explicitly aware of its ability to evade their most prized counter-artillery system. Back in Moscow, analysts at GRU headquarters and the KGB's first chief directorate began cross-referencing these field reports with global intelligence. They had access to technical manuals and NATO weapon identification guides. The description of a salvo of 12 rockets impacting simultaneously over a rectangular area, the fragments of the 227mm rocket bodies, and the distinctive M77 bomblet formed a perfect match for one system, and one system only, the American M26 rocket for the M270 MLRS. The conclusion was inescapable yet staggering. This was not a portable missile like the Stinger. This was a key component of the United States Army's deepest strike capability, a system so new it had only been fielded by NATO units 3 years prior. Its presence in Afghanistan meant the escalation was qualitative, not just quantitative. The Americans were not just prolonging the resistance. They were conducting a live-fire field test of their next-generation artillery doctrine against Soviet forces. The dawning realization within the senior ranks of the Soviet military was one of profound operational vulnerability. A staff colonel in the GRU, compiling a summary report for the Chief of the General Staff in late 1986, reportedly wrote, "The enemy has acquired the capability to deliver battalion-level artillery preparatory fires from standoff ranges beyond the effective counter-battery reach of our forward-deployed divisions. The psychological and material impact is disproportionate to the number of launchers. Each truck-mounted launcher now represents a mobile, battalion-sized artillery threat that can appear anywhere within a radius of 30 kilometers of our positions." The report highlighted the core of the shock. The Mujahideen, a non-state guerrilla force, had effectively been gifted the firepower equivalent of a Soviet artillery battalion, a force that required hundreds of men, dozens of vehicles, and complex logistics, and could deliver it from a single Toyota truck that could hide in a cave. This intelligence culminated in a series of urgent, classified briefings in the Kremlin. The political leadership, already reeling from the political and economic cost of the war, was presented with a new, grim military reality. The Stinger had closed the skies. Now the MLRS rockets were making the ground untenable. The safe spaces on the map, the rear area bases, the logistics hubs, the command posts, were being systematically erased from the board. The war was no longer just at the outpost perimeter or along the convoy route, it was everywhere. The technological tide, they realized with cold clarity, had turned decisively against them. Armed with the grim identification of the threat, the Soviet High Command in Afghanistan moved from analysis to action. Orders flowed from the 40th Army headquarters demanding immediate countermeasures. Yet, each tactical solution they implemented seemed to dissolve against the simple, adaptive reality of the Shaitani Chark. The confrontation became a case study in how a technologically superior but doctrinally rigid force can be outmaneuvered by a clever, agile adversary wielding a fragment of that same technology. The first and most obvious response was to hunt the launchers. Special Razvedka, reconnaissance. Teams from the GRU Spetsnaz and air assault units were tasked with deep penetration patrols into areas assessed as potential launch zones. They set ambushes along wadis and mountain passes. Mi-24 Hind helicopters, operating at higher, Stinger-dangerous altitudes, scanned the terrain for the distinctive trucks. The results were minimal. The launch sequence was too fast, the displacement too immediate. A Spetsnaz team might spend a week in a hazardous observation post only to hear the distant roar of a salvo from a valley 5 kilometers away, by which time the launch truck was gone. The cost of these hunter-killer operations in terms of manpower, aircraft hours, and exposure often outweighed any potential gain. The Mujahideen, masters of terrain and local intelligence, simply had too many places to hide. The second response was to harden and disperse. Division commanders issued directives to move ammunition dumps, scatter vehicle parks, and build revetments using Hesco bastion-type walls filled with local earth. But this was a defensive, resource-intensive posture. The concrete and engineering equipment required were finite. They could not fortify every garrison from Herat to Jalalabad. Dispersion also had a critical downside. It weakened force cohesion, made logistics more complex, and reduced the concentration of firepower needed for offensive operations. The Soviet army was being forced to play a shell game with its own vital assets, constantly moving them to avoid a strike that might never come for that specific target. The initiative had been surrendered. The third, and most technically focused, response was to adapt the counter-battery radar network. Technicians from the Soviet electronics industry were flown in to tweak the software of the 1B-13 ZU systems, trying to improve their discrimination of multiple, small, fast-moving rocket signatures. They attempted to deploy them in pairs, creating a crude triangulation net to pinpoint launches faster. But the physics were against them. The radar's wavelength and processing speed were fundamentally designed for a different problem set. Even if they could marginally speed up detection, the Mujahideen's shoot-and-scoot timeline, now refined to under 40 seconds, remained inside the Soviet decision loop. The Guardians were still blinking while the thieves had already fled. The failure of these countermeasures was not just a tactical setback. It represented a systemic erosion of the Soviet operational sanctuary. For a conventional army, the rear area is a place of respite, resupply, and command. In Afghanistan, the Soviet definition of rear had already shrunk from the USSR itself, to Kabul, to the wire of individual bases. The MLRS rocket pushed that boundary inward one final critical step, to the very walls of the barracks and the fuel point within the base. Nowhere was safe. The psychological corrosion was immense. A senior lieutenant, writing to a friend in Leningrad, captured the mood. Before we feared the road, the ambush, the mine. Now we fear the camp itself. You can be drinking tea, writing a letter, sleeping in your cot, and the sky just falls on you. There is no warning, just the sound of the world ending. And then silence and the screams. They say they have a new rocket. It doesn't matter what they call it. We call it the lottery. The turning point was not a single battle, but the collective realization across the Soviet officer corps that they could not effectively counter this new threat. The weapon had achieved its strategic purpose. It had introduced a form of paralysis. Planning for major offensives like the perennial assaults on the Panjshir Valley now had to factor in the potential for catastrophic, decapitating strikes against command and logistics elements before the operation even began. The cost-benefit analysis of every action shifted negatively. The correlation of forces, that sacred Soviet metric that always had to favor them, was now being skewed by a truck-launched rocket pod. By late 1987, the evidence of this tactical reckoning was visible in Soviet behavior. Major ground offensives grew rarer, more cautious, and shorter in duration. The war increasingly settled into a grim stalemate of garrison duty and convoy escorts, a war of attrition where the initiative lay squarely with the Mujahideen, who could choose when, where, and with what shocking force to strike. The god of war had been humbled not by a superior deity, but by a cunning trickster who had stolen a single potent thunderbolt. The climax was this quiet, pervasive understanding that permeated the 40th Army. They were no longer masters of their battlefield. They were targets in a shooting gallery whose dimensions they could no longer control. The arrival of the MLRS rockets did not just destroy fuel depots and command posts. It systematically dismantled the remaining fragments of morale and operational confidence within the 40th Army. The immediate aftermath of the technological shock was a force grappling with a new, pervasive kind of warfare where traditional metrics of security became meaningless. Morale and psychological collapse. For the average Soviet soldier, the kontraktnik, conscript, the war's dangers had always been geographical and situational. Danger was the road to the Salong Pass. Danger was a night patrol in the Green Zone. Danger was the outpost on the hill. The MLRS erased these boundaries. Now, danger was anywhere within a 30-kilometer radius of the enemy's imagination. The psychological sanctuary of the base was violated. Sleep, never easy, became haunted by the anticipation of that unique, rippling roar followed by instantaneous annihilation. A profound sense of helplessness set in. There was no enemy to shoot back at, no position to assault in retaliation. They were being punished by a ghost in the mountains, a ghost wielding American mathematics. Letters home and intercepted phone calls from military field exchanges increasingly spoke of a desire not for victory, but simply for survival until the end of a tour. The phrase Nadezhny Krysha, a reliable roof, took on a bitter, ironic meaning. There was no reliable roof anymore. Operational stagnation and resource exhaustion. The Soviet response of dispersion and hardening came at a crippling logistical and financial cost. The effort to fortify bases with earthworks and concrete diverted engineering battalions from road maintenance and other critical infrastructure. The constant movement of supply dumps created confusion and inefficiency in an already strained logistics chain. More critically, it forced a massive expenditure on passive defense. The resources poured into building revetments, acquiring and shipping blast walls, and constructing deep bunkers were resources not spent on offensive operations or on winning the allegiance of the Afghan population. The war economy of the occupation shifted from an aggressive, expansionist model to a defensive, preservationist one. Each base began to resemble a besieged fortress, not a launching pad for pacification. The artillery duel lost. The prestige of the Soviet artillery arm, the god of war, suffered a direct blow. The counter-battery duel, which they had dominated for years, was now a losing proposition. Reports from artillery commanders speak of frustration and a sense of impotence. They were firing costly barrages at empty launch points, wasting ammunition that had to be transported thousands of kilometers, while their own positions were under threat from a system they could not effectively locate or strike. The psychological advantage they held over the Mujahideen, the certainty of devastating retaliation, evaporated. This had a cascading effect on combined arms operations. Infantry and armor commanders lost faith in artillery's ability to suppress enemy indirect fire, making them more reluctant to venture beyond the wire, further cementing the stalemate. The Mujahideen's tactical renaissance. For the resistance, the MLRS rockets were a force multiplier of incalculable value. It allowed smaller factions to wield strategic influence. A single truck with a pod could now achieve effects that previously required the coordination of an entire Mujahideen brigade with multiple D-30s. It democratized deep strike capability. Successful attacks were filmed by ISI handlers on early video cameras. These grainy, dramatic images of soaring rockets and massive explosions became powerful tools for fundraising in the Arab world and for lobbying in Washington. The rockets provided not just military utility but political currency. Morale soared. The ability to strike the Soviets in their deepest sanctuaries validated the entire jihad, proving that divine favor and advanced technology were on their side. Tactics evolved further. Launches were sometimes conducted purely as psychological operations, firing salvos to deliberately land near but not on a base, keeping the entire garrison in a state of terrified alert for hours, wasting Soviet resources on futile reconnaissance patrols and alarm postures. The intelligence bonanza for the West. For the CIA and US military intelligence, the deployment of the MLRS rockets was an unparalleled field test. Through ISI debriefs and their own signals intelligence, they gathered real-world data on the system's performance against Soviet air defenses, command and control reactions, and the physical effects of the M77 submunitions on Soviet material. They were effectively stress-testing Soviet tactical doctrine and electronic warfare capabilities at zero risk to American personnel. The lessons learned about Soviet vulnerability to precision standoff fire would be meticulously studied and would directly influence NATO planning for the European theater. The conflict became a live laboratory, and the MLRS was one of its most revealing experiments. By 1988, as political negotiations for a Soviet withdrawal gained momentum in Geneva, the tactical reality on the ground had already been decided. The Soviet military was not defeated in a grand, climactic battle. It was being systematically exhausted, demoralized, and outthought. The MLRS rocket, this fragment of a system designed for the apocalypse in Europe, had played a crucial role in making the cost of staying unbearable. It had turned the vast, open landscape of Afghanistan into a claustrophobic trap, where every square kilometer of occupied territory was a potential kill zone. The invisible gun had imposed a silent, crushing tax on the will to fight. The withdrawal of the 40th Army in 1989 did not end the story of the MLRS shock. Its reverberations echoed through the halls of Soviet and later Russian military institutes, shaping doctrine and hardware for the next generation. The humiliation in Afghanistan became a crucible for a painful, comprehensive reassessment. The Soviet post-mortem and the birth of a doctrine. Within the General Staff Academy in Moscow, the war was dissected with brutal honesty. The performance of the MLRS rockets was a central case study. Soviet analysts concluded that they had been wrong-footed not merely by a weapon, but by a new reconnaissance strike complex, Разведывательно-ударный complex. The Americans had demonstrated a model: fuse intelligence from space and signals with a long-range, precise, and rapidly deliverable fire system. The Mujahideen truck was a crude node, but the concept was devastatingly clear. This analysis directly fed into nascent Soviet and later Russian concepts that would evolve into what is now known as reconnaissance fire contours and, ultimately, the modern Russian reconnaissance strike complex. The lesson was seared into their military consciousness. Future war would be a contest of seeing and striking first, with long-range precision fires as the decisive arm. Hardware as homage. The Smerch and Tornado revolutions. The Soviet response was not to copy the M270, but to double down on their own strengths while integrating the painful lessons. They already had a technical answer in development: the 9K-58 Smerch, Tornado, which entered service in 1987, just as the MLRS was biting in Afghanistan. The Smerch fired larger 300mm rockets to ranges of 70 to 90 kilometers, an explicit bid for overmatch. But the post-Afghanistan focus shifted from pure range and power to automation, precision, and counter-battery survival. This led to the development of the 9A52-4 Tornado, a wheeled, lightweight MLRS, and more importantly the 9K515 Tornado S, an upgraded Smerch. These systems incorporated automated fire control, inertial navigation for the launch vehicle, and, critically, guided rocket variants like the 9M542, which used GLONASS satellite correction to achieve circular errors probable of less than 10 meters. This was a direct, tangible response to the precision implied by the American system. The terror of the Shaitani Charka's area saturation was answered with a colder, more calculated promise of a single guided 300mm rocket destroying a specific building or command bunker. The proliferation paradigm. The other sobering lesson was the ease with which advanced submunition technology had proliferated to a non-state actor. The M77 bomblets littering Afghan valleys became a symbol of a new kind of threat. This experience heavily influenced Russia's later, often controversial, stance on international treaties banning cluster munitions and its development of alternative area effect warheads, like thermobaric charges for its rocket forces. They had seen firsthand how an advanced submunition could multiply the effectiveness of a simple platform, and they both feared and embraced the implication. The Chechen crucible and the wheel turning. The legacy was tested in the bloody crucible of the First Chechen War, 1994 to 1996. The Russian army, now the inheritor of the Soviet defeat, found itself in a hauntingly familiar role, a conventional force fighting in mountainous terrain against motivated, irregular fighters. This time, however, they wielded the systems born from the Afghan pain. The use of TOS-1A Solntsepek heavy flamethrower systems and massive, indiscriminate Grad and Uragan bombardments of Grozny were, in part, the application of a brutal logic. If you cannot pinpoint the guerrilla, you must destroy everything that could shelter him. It was the god of war returning with a vengeance, applying the old doctrine of mass with newly brutal efficiency, exorcising the ghost of Afghan impotence through sheer, terrifying volume. Yet even here the lack of precision and the resulting catastrophic collateral damage proved politically and strategically costly, reinforcing the drive toward the guided munitions seen in later conflicts. The proxy war comes home, the ultimate bitter irony of the MLRS transfer unfolded decades later. The technology of advanced rocketry and the tactical concepts of proxy warfare, refined in the Afghan theater, did not remain contained. They diffused through global networks of militants and state sponsors. In the 2020s, Russian forces in Ukraine would find themselves on the receiving end of a familiar tactic: precision strikes from Western-supplied, mobile rocket systems. Most notably the American M142 HIMARS, the direct, lightweight descendant of the M270. HIMARS, firing GMLRS-guided rockets with pinpoint accuracy, would inflict on the Russian military a shock eerily reminiscent of the one their predecessors felt in the Panjshir. Headquarters, ammunition depots and command posts far behind the front lines vaporized by strikes they struggled to counter. The wheel had turned a full circle. The reconnaissance strike complex, whose necessity was seared into the Russian military mind by the Mujahideen's MLRS, was now being used against them with a level of precision and integration they had theorized but, in practice, found themselves vulnerable to. The sting of the Shaitani Chark never truly faded. It transformed from a tactical surprise in a lost war into a foundational trauma that reshaped an army's philosophy. It sparked a race for long-range precision that defines modern artillery duels. And in a final, historical twist, it paved the way for a future where their own soldiers would stare at the sky, waiting for the thunder of rockets they had first heard echoed in the mountains of a war they could not forget. The story of the MLRS in Afghanistan is not merely a tale of a weapon's performance. It is a parable about the permeability of technology and the unpredictability of war. A system engineered for an apocalyptic clash of armored divisions on the North German plain found its most consequential proving ground not in Europe, but in the Neolithic landscape of the Hindu Kush, wielded by men whose fathers fought with Jaziel muskets. The Soviet generals were not stunned by the sheer explosive yield, nor the range. They were stunned by the conceptual violence of its arrival. It represented the intrusion of a foreign military logic into their own sphere of dominance. Artillery was their language, the grammar by which they understood battle. The MLRS spoke in a different dialect, one of networks, of silicon-speed decision loops, of precision emerging from chaos. The Shaitani Chark was a crude speaker, but the message was articulate and devastating. Your doctrine is obsolete. Your sanctuary is an illusion. Your God can be blasphemed. This moment crystallizes the essence of the late Cold War proxy conflict. It was no longer just about supplying old rifles to prolong a war of attrition. It was about the selective, surgical transfusion of capability, the transfer of a single component from a vast military ecosystem to create a systemic shock. The goal was not to match the Soviet army, but to disorient it, to force it to question fundamental truths about its own power. In doing so, the battlefield became a laboratory, and the Soviet soldier an unwilling test subject in an experiment that would redefine artillery warfare for decades to come. The legacy endures in the silent, automated dance of modern rocket artillery. In the satellite-corrected flight of a GMLRS round over Ukraine, in the calculated dispersal of a Tornado-S battery, one can trace a direct lineage back to the dust-clouded panic of a Soviet garrison in the Panjshir. The war ended. The withdrawal was completed. But the shockwave from those 12 rockets in 60 seconds never truly dissipated. It traveled through time, through military academies, through design bureaus, shaping the very fabric of how armies think about fire, range, and survival. In the end, the greatest impact was not on the landscape of Afghanistan, scarred as it was. It was on the mind of the enemy. The ultimate victory of the weapon was not the bases it destroyed, but the certainty it shattered. It proved that in the modern age, even a god of war could be humbled by a tool in the hands of a determined believer.